a lot, now you know I'm coming through. When the growth look good on you, best believe they wanna screw now. I've been trying to climb, devil threw me in the dark. Baby, don't be insecure, you can still go make a mark like blow. Could never let them drain my soul now. Blow. Table turning like doorknobs, wow. Blow. I think I'm about to set sail. I'm a walking, living legend, walking with my chest out. Life keeps dealing me cards, I keep feeling it.
What's going on? What's going on, people? It's G. We're back again for another summer transfer target video. And today we're going to be looking at Youssouf Fofana of Monaco. Again, before we even dive into anything, please make sure you smash that like button. Please make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Now, Youssouf Fofana, very good defensive midfielder. Tough tackling individual, someone who can play in the sixth position by himself or, you know, alongside someone in a double pivot. And I think that was one of the reasons as to why I thought about someone like him. Really heard of his name when, you know, when Tchouaméni was still at Monaco and the two of them were playing in the midfield. But obviously it was Tchouaméni who was the kind of the star, shall we say, so to speak. Obviously he then got his move, you know, to Real Madrid and stuff like that and blah, blah, blah. But you know, he kind of went along his business and went about his business, you know, just quite quietly, you know, again, let Tchouaméni kind of take the limelight and things like that. But I always looked at him and thought, yeah, he's a decent player. But again, I guess it's more, you always want to see more from these kind of players. You know, you always want to know, okay, seen you for a little bit now. Are you okay? Are you good? Blah, blah, blah. And, you know, this season, he's really stepped up the mantle, appeared for France, obviously in the World Cup, played that first game for France. Can't remember who it was against, and they ended up losing the game. I think it was the one game that they lost in that group stage. I think it was the last group stage game, and I think he played. And it just wasn't really a good performance overall, really, from France in a general sense. But you know, from him, it wasn't really too good, which I was a bit disappointed with. Then played, I believe he played in the semi-final. Played in that semi-final game, and I thought he was really good. I thought he really showed what he was about. You know, he was quite an important cog in the middle of the park. And as I mentioned before, you know, playing in that defensive midfield position, again, a position that I think Liverpool are slightly neglecting, so to speak. I think the way from what I'm gathering with the type of players that we're linked with and stuff like that, the Kefren Turams, the Kones, the Gravenberches and stuff like that, I'm almost a little bit baffed as to how he wants a defensive midfielder to kind of be. Again, if you like that kind of defensive midfielder, then of course that's going to be the type of player that you want. But when I think about someone like a Fofana, someone who can sit in the middle of the park, again, he could play by himself as well. But if you're going to have him, say, in a double pivot alongside, say, a Trent Alexander-Arnold, someone who's going to want that kind of free roam in the middle of the park to kind of do his own thing. I think when you've got someone like a Fofana, someone who's really good at tackling, he's still very good at passing as well. He can dribble himself out of situations. He's relatively progressive as well with the ball. He's not the best, but he's relatively quite good with the ball at his feet. But he's someone who's very good at intercepting and breaking up play. And I think when I look at something like that, and obviously alongside his physical attributes, you know, he's got the strength, he's got the power to be able to handle himself in the middle of the park, and he can dominate games really by himself just through his sheer willingness. I look at something like that and I think that's something that I'm quite, you know, intrigued about, but also something that I think maybe that's potentially the way that you want to necessarily go. Of course, you want to start playing football and doing this, that, and the other in the middle of the park, then hey ho, you might want to go with a Kone, you might want to go with Gravenberch or Thuram, whoever you're going to put there. But when I'm thinking of how Fabinho kind of plays, and when Fabinho was at his pomp, they are relatively similar in terms of someone who's very good at breaking up play, is in there to do that doggy work, is in there to kind of intercept and, you know, shut down the opposition attacks and counter attacks and things like that. But is also positionally aware. He understands, he knows where he needs to be. He knows how to read the game very well. He's got a very good football IQ. So when I'm watching him, passing wise, maybe Fabinho might have been a bit better at his pomp. But when I'm looking at just being a defensive midfielder, because you've got Trent Alexander-Arnold potentially next to you, he's the guy who you pop the ball to and worry about that. If you know you've got someone who's a warrior right beside you, you're going to be a lot more calmer about certain situations. And I think when I'm looking at someone like a Youssouf Fofana, especially with his performances for Monaco this season, you know, I think to myself, you know, why not? I took a look here, you know, back when he was, you know, when Tchouaméni and Fofana were both playing for the same team. you know, back in the 21-22 season. What I found kind of interesting is that they chose Tchouaméni instead. Now, obviously, Tchouaméni is more technically sound than a Fofana. I'll definitely grant him that. But in all other kind of aspects, they again, like I mentioned, they're relatively similar. Even if you look here now, Fofana's in the red graph, the red bar, should I say, and Tchouaméni's in the white. And when you look at it, this is back in the 21-22 season. This is obviously before Tchouaméni got his move to Real Madrid. But, you know, interceptions, Fofana's not that far off, but obviously Tchouaméni comes out on top. Tackles per 90, you know, he comes out on top there. Progressive carries per 90, you know, progressive passes, they're not too far off, you know, and even all the other shots, again, and this is where I would feel that Tchouaméni might have been looked at potentially more as maybe the shots. And, you know, like I said, he's more technically sound in my opinion, but Fofana's not that far off, to be honest with you. And I feel that he wouldn't command a massive fee. Again, I could just be talking out my arse here, you know, excuse the language, but to my knowledge, I don't feel like he'd command such a crazy fee. Now, if we're already looking at someone like a Tchouaméni, I'm thinking to myself, if you're already looking at Tchouaméni, he's going to cost you, well, Real Madrid apparently want about 80 million euros. I feel like Fofana can do more or less a similar type of role that a Tchouaméni could potentially do in the middle of your team. Why not go for someone like a Fofana? You know, wouldn't that be, especially because of the way that we want to spend money and how we spend money, wouldn't that represent a better deal? You know, potentially, again, we don't know how these players are gonna, you know, are gonna work themselves out. But when I'm looking at everything, and again, looking at the performances of Fofana this season, watching him, like I mentioned, I watched him probably more closely after the World Cup. Prior to that, it wasn't really many games. I know he played for Strasbourg, you know, prior to moving to Monaco. Again, he was young. I felt like he was quite he looked like he was a raw player, but he seems to refine his natural ability, his attributes and stuff like that. And now he looks a lot more well-rounded to be able to play in the middle of the park. And like I mentioned, he is someone that I think if you do want to play with just that lone six, he can do that. If you want to play alongside in a double pivot, he can do that as well, especially if you're alongside someone like a Trent or a Thiago or a Bajcetic, people who like to be on the ball a lot more, and people that want to get forward potentially a lot more. But, you know, that might be an area of his game that he may potentially need to improve upon. But when he's so good at everything else, I'm not going to be, you know, too fussed, if I'm being totally honest with you. You can see here, heat map, again, in the center of the park. That's where obviously he's going to be doing most of his business. Not going to get forward too much, but he can get himself forward. He does find himself in those positions at times, but he's comfortable in those positions. He is technically sound enough, I feel. I don't need it to be super technical. You know, we can't all have Rodri. You know, we can't all have Rodris or the Busquets of this world. You know, those guys are elite talents, you know, and they're very, very hard to find the Pedris, the Gavis and stuff like that. So I'm not saying that I wouldn't mind those kind of players, because who wouldn't? But at the same time, that's because the systems that they play in require players maybe of that kind of ilk. Do I believe that our system requires that kind of ilk? I don't necessarily think so. You know, look at the games this season. 47 games this season, 2 goals and 2 assists. Again, someone who's always readily available, doesn't necessarily get himself injured too tough. I think he's had quite a couple of injuries previously, but he's not someone, especially in this last season anyway, who's going to find himself, you know, out through much injury. Seems like he is a relatively durable individual. When we're looking here, obviously the positions that he's played mostly for Monaco, you can see centre midfield, defensive midfield, attacking midfield, just at one time, but defensive midfield and central midfield. So again, being able to rotate between the 2 positions, making sure that he's comfortable in both of those positions, definitely something to, you know, to look at. Again, big up 11 stats. Most of his game is going to be played as that right central midfielder. So even that, when I looked at that, I thought to myself, you know what, is that something potentially also to look at, because we need someone in that area. Now, in that right central midfield position, I almost feel that that position is almost taboo, because I don't really know what he wants from that guy who plays in that position in this box midfield. Because obviously you had Henderson there. Are you trying to get someone who's similar in terms of brilliant work rate, you know, got energy for days and stuff like that? But then if you are, then, you know, Fofana would be a good choice. If you're not, and you're looking for someone who's maybe a bit more attack-minded and stuff like that, attack-minded and things like that, then maybe someone like a Viega might represent a better option. A Zoboslai, if you can afford him, kind of thing. I think it just genuinely depends on what Jurgen Klopp kind of wants to, really do. When we look at the type of player that he is, he's Fofana. Fofana is a presence as well as an excellent reader of the midfield, and his versatility moving forward makes him a cut above a standard issue defensive midfielder. As I mentioned before, someone who's able to bring the ball forward and is comfortable in doing so. Not a problem with me. The player excels both on and off the ball with a strong progressive pass rate and an average of 3 tackles made per league match. So again, he is someone who's going to put himself about. Is that what we require from a player in that middle of the park, in that position, whether it be on that right central midfield position or whether it be in the pivot positions alongside someone else or in as a lone six? He's someone who's going to put himself about on the pitch, but he's still comfortable enough in those forward areas that it's not going to look a little bit weird, so to speak. I felt like at times with Fabinho, even though he's shown that he's got a, decent shot on him, it always looked a little bit like, don't really know if he's comfortable in that kind of area. He'd rather just pop the ball off and stuff like that, in those kind of areas. But even when he is in those kind of areas, it's like almost at times like a deer in the headlights. Whereas I feel like Fofana, it won't really be that kind of situation because he's comfortable in those kind of areas of the pitch. Even when we're looking at him and Fabinho, obviously Fabinho is on the left-hand side and Fofana on the right. This is obviously from the last season. You're looking here, interceptions. He's outdoing Fabinho in that regards. Progressive passes, he's outdoing Fabinho. Successful take-ons, Fabinho again not someone who's really going to do that. Progressive passes, as I mentioned before, passes attempted and pass completion. That's where I was. It's funny because obviously he's in the 43 percentile, but his passing per 90 is 81.4 percent. In terms of the completion, and he attempts about 50 passes per game, but that then comes down to, this is why I say stats, you've got to then read into, even though the stats are there, you've got to then read into the actual stats themselves to then understand, because obviously Fabinho's is very, very high, which is absolutely fantastic. But again, he plays for Liverpool, how Liverpool play, and obviously Liverpool being the more dominant team more often than not, I expect those to be relatively high anyway. If you look at here, between the two players, ground jewels, absolutely dwarfs Fabinho. Interceptions as well, so when the ball is on that ground, I am probably going to be a lot more comfortable with Fofana. Obviously Fabinho's had a really, really poor season by his standards, so whether you take that into consideration or not, again, totally up to you. Duels contested, again, he's putting himself about. Tackles made, tackles completed. It's only really the take-on success that Fabinho is kind of outdoing him in, and again, I put that more down to context of the team that he's playing for. Passes, again, Fabinho brilliant with 805 in comparison to Fofana's 595. But what's funny though is that Fofana makes more forward passes, even though he doesn't make as many passes as Fabinho, kind of thing. So I was like, okay, fair enough. Obviously, this pass is completed in own half. All these kind of different things, short passes. Again, Fabinho is going to obviously outdo him in that regard. So big up to him in that respect. Long passes, successful long passes, long pass accuracy, through balls per game. Again, that's something to also look at as well, because as much as you are the defensive midfielder, if you are capable and have got that in your locker, it does kind of bode well, especially because if you're trying to play a progressive style of football, you might need that from your defensive midfielder or potentially right-sided central midfielder. So again, that's why I'm looking at the two players, because I felt like they're almost similar in terms of where they can play, for the team. He can play a multitude of positions, whereas obviously Fabinho can't, which is obviously fine to a degree, but the fact that he can do both roles relatively well, again, I'm going to lean, more towards someone like a Fofana. But guys, let me know what you think, in the chat. Yeah, Fofana obviously plays for Monaco, France international as well. Is he someone that you think, Liverpool should potentially be in for? Do you think that obviously especially because I feel that he can play in that he can play in that sixth position. And I think that would probably be, for me, the position that I would put him in the double pivot alongside someone else. With all the other names that we've been linked with, is that someone that you think would do a good job for the team? Do you think maybe no, you'd rather see someone else, in those positions? Let me know what you guys think about that. in the comment section below. I'm G. That's another transfer target done and dusted, and we are out.